So that's an example of something, a way that you might be able to separate the pools within a support area. Parking, however, every parking space is kind of generic. There's no easy way to distinguish between parking spaces, unless you worked at one of those hospitals that gave priority parking to certain people. Now, once you do decide whether or not there's one type or two types of sub-services, you might call them, within a support area, the next thing to do is figure out what the cost drivers are. In other words, on what basis will you allocate this department, that support areas, on what basis will you distribute those costs? For example, if you're looking at housekeeping expenses right there, basing it based on square feet might make some sense. But basing it on the revenue of the department being cleaned probably doesn't make sense, because it might give you incentive to only clean the profitable departments and let the other ones get dirty. Now, speaking of which, in terms of the characteristics of that cost driver, in other words, how you should do it, it should be a relatively fair measure. And it should, now this comes with a big warning. You do want it to give the department an incentive to reduce its use of the shared service. So, for example, if the collection, using that collection example again, if collections is not fairly treated, a lot of departments might just say, keep trying to collect forever, or get really nasty with customers. But what that happens is then you need more and more staff in collections, so the collection activity starts to cost you more and more, because you never gave the other departments an incentive to not overuse them. Now, that said, especially in a public health setting, you've got to be very careful about unintended consequences. A lot of times your screening people are kind of considered overhead. In other words, the people who screen newly pregnant mothers and things like that, screen them for whether or not they need extra help or qualify for help. The problem with a cost reduction strategy might be that you underscreen for important problems such as mental health. So while you don't want to give departments an incentive to overuse these support activities, which they might see as quote-unquote free help, you also want to be very careful that you're not cutting off your nose to spite your face. One of the questions asks about the allocation process, and well, there it is right there. And then the last question talks about the allocation methods. And there's a few different types. The direct allocates all costs back to the mission-related activities. It can be tedious because you've got to trace back how much of each support area is used in which area. In this reciprocal method, what they do is they recognize that certain support activities themselves use other support activities. For example, house cleaning cleans the building department. So then what you have to do is you have to take the costs from the cleaning department here and send them back to the billing department there. But then remember, the costs in the billing department go back to other revenue generating departments such as your emergency room and so forth. But then to take that one step further, there's your cost of administration, the C-suiters, and their admin, their abilities are used to monitor your cleaning people, but they're also used to monitor your billing people and so forth. So you can see you can think of this reciprocal as a very complex daisy chain where money goes from here to here to here. It gets to be a lot of work because for each different transaction, each different allocation, you're trying to come up with a different way of allocating that. Remember that basis we talked about earlier? So whereas where the cleaning activities might have been going based on square foot, your admin activities might be allocated based on full-time employees in each department. So you can kind of see how it gets a little bit crazy fast. Now the step down is what they call a compromise, basically. It recognizes that there's all these departments, but it only kind of takes one pass. So it's like whereas this daisy chain, if you actually extend it all the way, it can actually start feeding back into itself. So you've got to make several passes before the costs are fairly allocated. It gets really complex. Whereas the step down kind of just says, we're going to daisy chain, but we're going to do it just once. And we're going to arbitrarily start in one area, let's say admin, allocate those costs to here, and then allocate those costs with no feedback. That's what the step down is. All of these allocation processes will generally be figured out by the CFO and the accounting folks. The reason it's worth reading through is that at some point in your career, hopefully you'll be a manager. And when you're a manager, you'll be given budgets and so forth, and somewhere in there will be your share of the support activities like billing or parking and things like that. And you might question, how come your department is being charged so much? And that would be a good time to come back, read this chapter, and then maybe ask the finance folks for a little bit better explanation. And maybe you can open up negotiations so that your department isn't what you might think of as being overcharged. Now, the rest of this chapter, you can see right there, looks at profit margin, which we kind of already talked about in chapter 4. All the formulas and all the maths are identical, so I'm not going to go back over them again. Worth reading through just because this does it with a public health example, but all the mechanics are well described in chapter 4. The same is true for this key concept, the break-even analysis, which is also described in detail with all the numbers and all the Excel work in chapter 4 as well. Chapter 4 even touches on this concept of marginal analysis as well. So it's worth watching the chapter 4 lecture to understand the mechanics and reading through this just to see how it can